welcome to a special midweek episode of the Dram show with me, Chris Goodrum. I thought, as I'd got a few days off, I'd slip in an extra episode of the show. And as you know from watching last week, well, I hope you all watched last week's episode of the show. And for those of you that did, a big thank you. Thank you for your comments, the sharing on social media. Big thank you to the distillery for sharing on their social media platform. That was really kind of them. So obviously they liked what I said, which is good. So yeah, I thought, well, as I've got some time on my hands, I'll slip in the second episode, so we kind of keep the momentum going, as they say. And obviously come Sunday there'll be another episode of the show on something completely different, which I'll figure it out when we get there. So yeah, there's not a huge amount to say. Obviously I gave you guys a sort of an introduction to the distillery, the history, the working practices, that kind of thing in the previous episode. So if you haven't actually sort of watched that, please do so. Get yourself up to speed with the actual information about the distillery itself. Really there's not a great deal to say apart from let's just take a look at today's one. Like to sit on the back seat of your car. Right, okay, so as like the previous episode of the show, we're going to kick off with the Peated new make spirit. As again, for those of you that didn't watch last week's episode of the show, I've split the Annandale into unpeated, which was last week, and the peated spirit that they produce this week. Peated to, if memory serves me correct, about 45 parts per million. So a fair peating level. You know, there should be some good peat here. So this is the new make spirit, the Rascally liquor, and bottled at this is bottled at obviously the filling strength, which is 63.5%. Of course, before I do go on, any comments I do make during today's episode of the show are wholly my own and have no bearing or relevance to the company employs me. Just in case. Probably not going to need to worry about that, but anyway. So we're going to then move on to the actual single malts themselves. So again, 2015 vintage. So this is the Man O Sword ex-Bourbon. This particular bottle is 58.4% and is Bourbon cask 473. Then we're going to move on to the sherried vintage. So again, 2015. Sherry cask number 776, this time 59.7%. So my butt has been refilled. Oh, I don't think I'll ever get tired of that bit of yeah. And finally, the STR cask. So STR Burgundy casks. This is cask number 352 and bottled at 60.7%. Again, like the unpeated STR, this is the 2017 vintage of the Founders Selection. So as you remember from last week, there was quite the quality of the spirit was very, very good, really interesting stuff. So expecting good things from the peated stuff. So let's kick off with the new make. Okay, so new make. Let's see what the nose gives us on this then, shall we? So like the unpeated, very barley forward. Quite sweet barley in actual fact. The peat is quite ashy. And sweet as well. Certainly not got any kind of medicinal, iodine, salt, that kind of thing. So we're obviously looking at mainland peat. Nice sweetness, nice aromatic, almost kind of honeysuckle note. Again, there's a little bit of a biscuitiness, not very much, and that slight sort of juniper-y kind of herbal note is certainly noticeable. So stylistically, as you would expect, pretty much like the unpeated new make, with the addition of a little bit of peat. And it's, yeah, the peat is quite prominent, but it's certainly sort of nicely balanced, well sort of like integrated into the character of the spirit. See what the palate's like. Quite chewy. Mask finish, obviously. Again, straw-like barley. Not so much of the honey. The alcohol is kind of dampening down on the honey. Again, the peat is quite ashy. Again, slight herbaceous note coming through. And yeah, obviously finished quite masked. Obviously, you can notice the alcohol is sort of pretty intense. But it's got a lovely aftertaste. The barley, the sweetness of the barley is coming back on the aftertaste, and like the unpeated new make, really clean, very fresh. Just a little bit of an off the still kind of note, but you know, really very, very impressive, as we said. Right, drop of water brings out that ashy peat character. It's brought it forward quite a bit. No real change, kind of like in the aroma profile, really. A little bit less of the sweeter barley and a little bit more of the straw-like barley, possibly, and the fact that the peat is a little bit more prominent, but overall hasn't really changed a great deal. Let's see what pass like. Yeah, taking the alcohol down a tad has certainly brought out that honeyed sweetness. Quite ashy, quite herbaceous on the finish. So it's quite interesting that how the herbaceous character of the spirit is kind of blending in with the ashiness of the peat, and it's got a lovely aftertaste that really does linger amazingly well. I mean, you know, for new make, like I said, this is pretty complex. Yeah, alright, you can argue it's a bit linear, it's a bit straightforward, but it's got a good progression, it's interesting, and like I always say, you know, if you've got an interesting quality new make, then, you know, the chances are that, unless you make a real balls up of it, you know, during sort of maturation, and your cask policy is a bit crap, then, you know, chances are you're going to end up with a quality product at the end of the day. And, you know, I think it's testament to the skills of the distillery, certainly the distillery team, that, you know, they are making an absolutely gorgeous new make. So really good. Right, okay, so let's move on to the ex-Bourbon. So again, 2015 vintage, no older than, really, I would have said 6 years old probably. Let's see what the nose gives us. Right, well, the alcohol is probably a little bit more noticeable in actual fact. I'm quite surprised. It's given me quite a nose prickle. But again, lovely barley, white fruit, touch of heather, sweeter peat. I'm not getting quite so much ashiness on the nose of this. The peat has got a slightly more heathery, kind of sweeter character. The American oak is kind of sitting in the background, is giving a little bit of creaminess, a little bit of vanilla. There's a touch of citrus, there's maybe some marzipan-y notes right on the edge. Apricot, little bit of tar possibly. Again, that's a lovely nose. Emphasis fairly firmly on the barley, with the sort of the peat and the wood taking a sort of a secondary kind of role, a sort of a backup kind of role. Really very impressive. You know, it's a lovely nose. It's certainly one of those noses you want to just keep sniffing. You're getting sort of different things. It's for a young spirit, you know, about like I say, 5, 6 years old. It's showing a remarkable amount of complexity, and I think it will be interesting to see how this continues to evolve. Anyway, let's see what the palate's like. That's really tight. The alcohol is kind of pretty much masking all of the palate. Again, some barley notes, some sweet pea, a little bit of apricot, touch of vanilla, but it's really tight. It's really intense. Grittiness on the aftertaste, sort of like that kind of sort of peat smoke particles. You know, if you've ever sort of like, you know, been too close to a sort of like a coal fire, you know, and you just get a face full of smoke, you get those particles, sort of, you know, grit, dust and what have you, and it's definitely got that as an aftertaste. Again, I think this needs some dilution. Let's hope that kind of opens things out a bit. Brought forward the oak now, sweeter, creamier, more vanilla, more honey. Sweetened the peat notes as well. The peat is kind of a little bit sort of, again, sitting sort of slightly in the background. Fuller, a little bit more, almost kind of estery fruit. It's certainly sort of moving in that direction. Yeah, that's opened it up, an absolute treat. Again, sort of really nice nose. Let's see what the palate's like. Pretty much like the nose. A lot softer, a lot more rounder, a lot more vanilla, a lot more oak, barley, honey. Again, the peat is kind of pretty much relegated to the finish in actual fact. Again, it's got that sort of dustiness, really nicely balanced. It's not the kind of like the focal point, which sometimes some whiskies, certainly when distilleries, I mean, I've noticed this with, like I said, I've probably said this a number of times, distilleries that are not renowned for the use of peat tend to start off with, you know, a really light peating level. They'll be somewhere sort of like, you know, 10, 12, 15, 20, shall we say. And certainly the peat is not the focus. It's a kind of sitting in the background, like the Annandale, just adding a nuance. And then for some reason or other, maybe it's a change of blender or master blender or distiller or what have you, you know, suddenly up goes the peating level, you know, into the sort of 40s and the 50s, and suddenly the peat is just hammering at you, and you're sort of thinking, well, okay, I can see why they're doing it, because people love peated malts, but you're kind of like getting away from, you know, a peated Spey, for argument's sake, or a peated Highland. You know, you're kind of getting away from that, and you're trying to just essentially, in essence, ape an Islay. And, you know, why do that? I don't understand. Can't see the point, you know. Islas are Islas, Highlands are Highlands, you know, keep some sort of perspective here. But anyway, I digress. Coming back to this bottling, lovely, absolutely gorgeous. Whether it's black or white, we eat what's on the table. Right, okay, so moving on to the sherry bottling. Let's see what those gives us on this end, shall we? Now, although this is a higher ABV, 59.7, I'm not smelling it. It's quite well contained. And like the unpeated sherry bottling, it's very heavy on the sherry, very Oloroso. Lots of dried fruit, herbal Oloroso. Don't get a great deal of peat, not really getting much in the way of distillery character. There's no barley per se. There's a bit of burnt heather maybe, a little bit of prune, some tar possibly. But again, it's kind of, yeah, the nuance of the spirit and the peat is kind of really lost on the nose, and you know, it's very clean. There's no blemishes, and of course, you know, if you love your sherry whiskies, then of course you're gonna love this. But for me, it lacks the light and shade. It's pretty much, it's not quite in the sherry monster mold. There is a little bit of something else going on, but you really have to kind of work the nose hard to kind of get anything else out of it other than the sherry. See what the palate's like. quite tannic, quite drying. Combination of the tannins and the alcohol really masking the finish on this one. Quite pruny. I'm getting an almost kind of PX-like character now. If this was sort of like, you know, a distillery that had been in you know, since working flat out, you know, since the 1800s, yeah, you could have possibly said, well, although there's claims in Oloroso, but it could be a PX, but you know, you never know. But obviously, as the distillery's not been going very long, they've probably got a pretty good idea of the inventory, shall we say. So, but it's got a very PX-y-like character. It's very pruny. It's winey. It's slight treacle, dried fruit, a little bit of tar. Again, not really a great deal of barley. Not really a great deal of light and shade. But again, very, very clean. No blemishes. Nice ashiness on the aftertaste, it has to be said. Let's see what the nose gives us now with a little drop of water. It's got a bit of a rawness to it now. It's kind of brought out, and it's not something that I've noticed generally, this rose petal mar. I really haven't picked that up on any of the other bottlings. I could be wrong, but it does have a rawness to it. They've stripped away the sort of several layers of sherry, and yeah, it's a bit, yeah. There's a sort of almost kind of confected sweetness there as well. The sherry is kind of morphed into this sort of slightly, not quite boiled sweets, but confectionery kind of sweetness. And I hate to say it, but it really isn't floating my boat whatsoever. Let's see what pass one now. I'll give it there's a bit of a better balance on the palate now. I do get a little bit of barley. The sherry's got sort of, it's kind of brought out a little bit of gingery spice. Again, the peat is kind of really only kind of comes through on the finish, and again, it's not particularly intense. It's dusty. It's ashy. There's a bit. I wouldn't quite say too much tannin. There's a nice amount of tannin. It bites a little bit. It dries, and again, still along with the alcohol, it's kind of a little bit. Wouldn't quite go as far as saying austere, but it kind of like does kind of clamp down a bit on the finish. It's not the most successful of the trio, shall we say, and to be honest with you, after having tasted the unpeated spirit, and I wasn't a big fan of the sherry cask in that, I didn't think I was going to be the world's biggest fan of the sherry cask peated version. But like I said, if you love that kind of style of whiskey, you're going to really love that. But it's not quite sort of peat and sherry, and it's not, maybe there's just not enough, maybe it's not peated enough to kind of like go, whoa, wow, peat and sherry. But, you know, it is what it is, I suppose. Right, okay, so let's move on to the STR cask. Now, as you remember from the previous episode of the show, I really liked the unpeated STR cask. A great value for money. Should we say, all right, cheaper than the other two, and yeah, really nice. So I'm kind of looking forward to seeing what the peated version is like. So interesting. Really chocolatey. Wheat flakes, barley, ginger, tannins, spice, red fruit. It's kind of almost given the peat a real astringent character. Again, it's quite dusty, although there is that sort of herbaceous note kind of coming through. I mean, that's a fab nose. It really is. It's just, the spirit is just working so well with the STR casks. It's not overwhelmed. It's really well balanced. There's a touch of vanilla. Some dried red fruit, some sweet red fruits, and again 60.7%, and I can't smell that alcohol. Dangerous stuff, it has to be said. But yeah, really chocolatey, really complex, really very good, it has to be said. So pass on. yeah, all right, okay, that's masked a bit on the finish. You can taste that that's a cask strength bottling, but you really wouldn't have pegged that for 60-odd%. That alcohol is really well contained in amongst the sort of like the juicy, slightly syrupy red fruits. Kicks off with some lovely spicy, tarry tannins, red fruits, quite sort of, again, gritty peat. But there's also a sweetness to the peat as well. Maybe not a huge amount of barley per se. Feels like there's more peat character there. And it just goes to show how maybe this batch had a slightly higher peating level. Who knows? But it certainly goes to show that sort of sherry casks certainly seem to sort of compress peat character, or certainly within this tasting, assuming that of course they're all peated to exactly the same parts per million. It's certainly that the sherry casks are suppressing that peat. Whereas the STR casks don't. They kind of almost, in essence, emphasise the peat. They kind of like build it up, and it's got, like I said, it's got a lovely spiciness, tariness, juiciness, yeah, I think sort of like the unpeated STR cask, very, very impressive. Doesn't really change the nose a great deal, although there is an almost kind of fishy brininess, and when I first tasted this, it kind of like, it really reminded me of Campbelltown, and obviously, well, they're nowhere near to each other, but it's not quite Campbelltowny, it's not quite fishy enough, but there's an element there, so you guys that love Springbank, maybe you want to sort of try this. This could be the next. You can't get your hands on any bloody Springbank because, well, you know how it goes. Yeah, I like this nose. Slight rubberiness, sort of peaty rubberiness rather than sort of like spirit rubberiness. Yeah, let's see what that's like. Chewy, juicy, fruity. Again, there's that fishiness. I mean, is it me? Possibly. There's again quite an astringent peatiness or an astringent edge to the peat, and it's really quite prominent. But again, a little bit of barley, a little bit of a herbaceous note there. But that oily fishiness is just kind of like, where the hell is that coming from? I mean, it's possible, I suppose, that this particular batch of peated barley may well have used Campbelltown peat. What's the peat bog in Campbelltown? I can't remember the bloody name now. I didn't actually think it was in operation. It may well be. It may. I mean, this is the thing. I don't know quite how this Annandale, for argument's sake, specifies with their malting company that the peat, whether they basically say, look, 47 parts per million, you get on with it, you find out the peat, you deal with it, or whether they actually go into sort of more specific characteristics. I'm guessing that because this is, not as an expensive, or should we say the price of this isn't as expensive as the sherry and the bourbon cask, that they probably don't go into nth detail. They don't probably go, yes, we definitely want Campbelltown peat, and all that kind of stuff. So so maybe this is a slight aberration. Maybe this is just just happened to be when whatever their malting company was doing this particular batch, they used Campbelltown peat. I don't know. I mean, this is questions. There's always questions. There's always sort of like and sometimes you do ask the distilleries these kind of questions, and sometimes they have the answers for them. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes it's just sort of one of those things, and you kind of like just have to go along. And maybe it's just me. Like I said, maybe it's a kind of an association thing. Maybe I'm just going, oh yeah, that's a bit Campbelltown-y, but somebody else tastes it and they don't get that at all. But anyway. All I can say is it's a bloody good whiskey at the end of the day, and that's all that really counts, isn't it? Right, okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show. Well, hope you enjoyed this episode of the show. I kind of rambled and kind of a little bit, kind of went off on a sort of a bit of a weird tangent, I suppose. But anyway, kind of coming back to the juice, as they say. Again, really impressed with the new make, and as I've often said, if you have a great new make spirit, chances are you're going to end up with a great whiskey further down the line. And I think this is kind of like, just shows how that that equation kind of works, I suppose. Yeah, lovely new make spirit, lovely sort of intensity of peat, but not overly intense. Really quite nicely balanced and very drinkable in my opinion. The bourbon cask, again, like the unpeated spirit, kind of like it is, I suppose, my preferred bottle. I mean, although the STR cask, I can't speak now, alcohol, it was incredibly impressive. I love the purity of it. It's kind of like, when you taste the new make and you move on to the bourbon, you can just see the progression. You can get the spirit character with the augmentation of the American oak, and it just works absolutely wonderfully. The sherry cask, again, like the unpeated sort of sherry cask bottling, not really my cup of tea. Too much sherry character, not enough distillery character, and not enough peat as well, really, to be bluntly honest with you. But I kind of, like I said, you can purchase the three samples in a lovely sort of 6 bottle gift pack. So, like I said, with everything, don't just take my word for it. Okay, I do this as a sort of for a living. It's kind of my job to be to sort of taste whiskey and critique it, I suppose, but don't take my word for it. Everybody's palate is different, everybody's likes are different, and I would definitely urge, if you're interested, if you're curious, to get hold of at least the sample set and do this tasting, and watch the video at the same time. Taste it, watch the video, see what you think, see whether I'm talking out my arse or not, or whatever. Anyway, and the STR cask, finally, lovely bottling. Just all round gorgeous at the end of the day. Works really nicely, works with the spirit. Obviously, Dr. Jim Swan was certainly onto something when he kind of, I wouldn't say created this, but obviously was sort of the guiding hand in this process. And as we've seen from a number of the distilleries that Dr. Swan had a guiding hand in, they are absolutely fabulous. And like I say, love what Annandale's doing. It's a little bit on the expensive side, and hopefully, given a couple more years, they will kind of like reevaluate what their pricing policy and bring it down a little bit more. Hopefully, but certainly worth having a look at. So, anyway. And finally, big thank you to Annandale for the samples for both episodes of the show. Hopefully, that they will they like what they hear. Hopefully, you guys will pick up a bottle or at least pick up a tasting pack and give it a try. Until then, until sort of Sunday odd, all I have to say is good afternoon and good dramming. Oh, it is just afternoon.